Hey guys, tonight we're climbing the cold stone steps of history to explore the miserable, thankless world of medieval castle guards. You're standing at attention on a windswept battlement, rain seeping through your chainmail, your stomach growling from the thin gruel that passed for dinner, and your eyes straining to stay open after 14 hours of mind-numbing vigilance. This isn't some glorious adventure with sword fights and damsels. It's mind-numbing boredom, punctuated by moments of absolute terror. Welcome to the reality of being a medieval castle guard, where the cold is your constant companion, sleep is a luxury you can't afford, and death lurks around every corner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your life as a medieval castle guard doesn't begin with a calling or a dream. It starts with desperation. You're the third son of a peasant farmer with no inheritance to speak of, or maybe a former soldier with nowhere else to go. The castle needs bodies on the walls, and you need food in your belly. It's not a romantic arrangement, but it's survival. Your first day of training isn't about sword techniques or battle tactics. It's about staying awake when your body is screaming for sleep. The senior guard, a weathered man with a face like tanned leather and fingers missing from his left hand, doesn't waste time with pleasantries. Eyes open, mouth shut, he grunts as he hands you a rusty spear. Miss what you're supposed to see, and it's not just your neck on the block, it's everyone inside these walls. He's not exaggerating. In a world without security cameras, motion detectors, or even reliable locks, human vigilance is the only thing standing between safety and slaughter. The weight of that responsibility settles on your shoulders, like the mail shirt you can barely afford. Heavy, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Your quarters aren't what you'd call comfortable. You share a cramped stone room with 5 other guards, sleeping on straw mattresses that double as homes for fleas, lice, and occasionally rats. Privacy is non-existent. Your personal possessions fit in a small wooden chest or a cloth sack tucked under your bed. The smell is something you never quite get used to. Sweat, leather, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present dampness that seems to seep from the castle walls themselves. In winter, it's freezing, with only thin blankets and shared body heat to keep you from shivering through the night. In summer, it's stifling, the air thick with the stench of too many men in too small a space. But you don't spend much time in your quarters anyway. Your shift schedule guarantees that. Medieval castle guards didn't work neat 8-hour rotations. You might be on duty for 12, 14, even 16 hours at a stretch, especially during times of heightened alert. Day shifts, night shifts, dawn watches. Your body never adjusts to a consistent rhythm. Sleep deprivation becomes your constant companion. You learn to doze standing up, one eye half open, spine rigid against the battlements. You develop a sixth sense for when the captain is approaching, jerking to alertness moments before he appears. Getting caught sleeping on duty isn't just a reprimand. It could mean flogging, dismissal, or worse. And let's talk about the weather. Oh, the weather. Standing watch on castle walls means you're exposed to every whim of nature with minimal protection. Summer heat bakes you in your padded armor, sweat pouring down your back, metal fittings becoming hot enough to burn. Rain soaks through everything, leaving you shivering and chafed. But winter is your true enemy. Bitter winds cut through the strongest walls, finding every gap in your clothing Snow and sleet make the stone treacherous, turning simple patrol routes into death traps of ice. Your fingers grow so numb you can barely grip your weapon, your face so cold that speaking becomes painful. You stand there hour after hour, watching an empty horizon, the cold seeping into your bones until it feels like you'll never be warm again. Frostbite claims fingers and toes with terrifying regularity. Veterans show off their blackened stumps as badges of honor, proof they've survived what many haven't. And what about the food? Forget feasting halls and roasted meats. That's for the nobility, not for the likes of you. Castle guards subsisted on the medieval equivalent of mess hall slop, watery porridge, hard bread, the occasional dried fish, or salted meat. Beer was common, not as a luxury, but because it was often safer than water. Your meals are eaten quickly, sometimes cold, often standing up or walking your route. During sieges or emergencies, you might go days with nothing but hard bread and whatever water can be spared. Malnutrition and digestive ailments are as common as calluses on your hands. The pay is barely enough to survive on. A few coins pressed into your palm each week or month, depending on your lord's generosity. Some guards are paid partially in food, shelter, or the dubious privilege of protection. Many supplement their income through petty corruption, taking bribes to look the other way for minor infractions, extorting travelers, or pilfering small items from the castle stores. Most guards don't save money. They spend it as soon as they get it. Ale houses and brothels near castles do a roaring trade on paydays. When tomorrow might bring an arrow to your throat or a sword to your gut, why worry about next month? But the worst part, the absolute worst part of being a medieval castle guard, isn't the cold or the hunger or the exhaustion. It's the crushing, mind-numbing, soul-destroying boredom. Hour after hour, day after day, you stare at the same stretch of land, the same tree line, the same road winding toward the horizon. Nothing happens. Nothing changes. Your mind drifts, then snaps back to attention at a bird's flight or a branch's movement. False alarms become a welcome break in the monotony. You develop strange habits to stay alert, counting stones in the wall, making up stories about peasants in the fields below, reciting prayers or songs under your breath, anything to keep your mind functioning through another endless watch. And then, when boredom has nearly driven you mad, when your guard is at its lowest, that's when the real danger strikes. Because being a castle guard isn't always boring. Sometimes it's absolutely terrifying. Imagine standing on the battlements at dawn after a quiet night watch. Your eyes are heavy, your thoughts already on the hot porridge waiting in the kitchen. Then you see it, movement at the forest edge. Not the usual kind, not farmers or merchants. This is different, organized, methodical. By the time you sound the alarm, the first arrows are already flying. The dull thud of a siege engine breaks the morning quiet. Suddenly, your world narrows to the few feet of wall around you, the shield in your grip, the height of the approaching ladders. In peacetime, guards might go years without seeing real combat, but when violence came, it was swift, brutal, and often fatal. Raiders, rival lords, peasant uprisings, all posed deadly threats that could materialize with little warning. The castle might be built for defense, but you, the guard, you're expendable. You're the first line, meant to buy time with your blood. Your training likely consisted of basic weapon handling and whatever experience you brought with you. Against professional soldiers or determined attackers, those odds aren't favorable. If enemies breach the walls, you fight in narrow corridors and cramped staircases where your friend's blood makes the stone slick under your feet. If they bring siege engines, You watch helplessly as stones crash through roofs and walls, crushing anyone beneath. If they settle in for a long siege, you slowly starve alongside everyone else, still expected to maintain your watch with dwindling strength. And the dangers weren't just from outside. Castle guards also served as internal security and makeshift police force, breaking up drunken fights, apprehending thieves, escorting prisoners, all added risk to an already dangerous job. Intervene in a brawl between off-duty soldiers, and you might end up with a knife between your ribs. Arrest the wrong person, someone connected to your lord or lady, and your position could vanish overnight. Fail to stop a genuine threat, and punishment would be severe, possibly fatal. The politics of castle life added another layer of danger. Guards were often caught between competing factions within the household. Serve the steward or the master-at-arms. Follow the lady's orders or the lord's. Back the wrong person in times of succession or conflict, and your loyalty becomes a liability. Some guards survived by becoming utterly neutral, refusing to engage in any court intrigue. Others thrived by selling information to multiple parties, walking a dangerous tightrope of divided loyalties. Many simply kept their heads down and prayed they wouldn't be noticed. Disease was another constant threat. Medieval castles weren't the hygienic showcases we see in sanitized Hollywood productions. They were crowded, often damp, with primitive sanitation and close quarters. Perfect breeding grounds for illness. When dysentery swept through the barracks, you might lose half your fellow guards in a week. When the Black Death arrived, the castle walls offered no protection at all. And medical care? Hope you're on good terms with the local barber surgeon or herb woman, because that's as sophisticated as it gets. Guards who survived long enough to age faced another grim reality. There was no retirement plan, no pension waiting after decades of service. When you became too old, too slow, or too injured to effectively stand watch, you were simply done. The lucky ones might be kept on in reduced roles, training younger guards, maintaining equipment, or serving as doorkeepers. The unlucky simply found themselves outside the castle gates, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they'd managed to save. Many ended up as beggars, their bodies broken by years of standing watch in all weather. Others joined mercenary companies, trading on their experience for a few more years of paid violence. Some returned to family farms or trades, if they had such connections to fall back on. Most didn't. Look at your fellow guards, the ones who've been doing this for decades. Study their faces, weathered, scarred, eyes perpetually shadowed from lack of sleep. That's your future, if you're fortunate enough to have one. The senior guard, the one who first handed you that spear, pulls you aside one evening after your watch. His voice is low, cracked from years of shouting orders in driving rain and howling wind. 23 years I've walked these walls, he says, staring out over the darkening countryside. Seen 3 lords come and go, fought in 2 sieges, survived 1 plague, lost these fingers to frost, this scar to an arrow, this limp to a fall on the steps. He turns to you, his eyes reflecting the torchlight. Know what I've earned for it? The right to die in harness, most likely. No land, no home beyond these stones, just the knowledge that I did my duty. He claps you on the shoulder, his grip still strong despite his age. Remember that when the wind cuts through your cloak at midnight, or when you haven't seen your bed for 2 days during an alert. We don't do this for glory. There isn't any. We do it because someone must. And that's it, isn't it? The fundamental truth of being a medieval castle guard. It was a thankless job that someone had to do, essential work that earned little respect and less reward, the invisible backbone of medieval security, remembered only when they failed, forgotten when they succeeded. As you stand on the battlements for your night watch, eyes straining against the darkness, back aching from the weight of your mail, you understand why so few chose this life willingly. Yet, here you are, another anonymous figure on the wall, another set of eyes in the night, part of an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries. The moon slides behind clouds, plunging the landscape into deeper shadow. You adjust your grip on your spear, roll your shoulders to ease the stiffness, and continue your patrol, one foot in front of the other, 1 hour at a time, one watch, one day, 1 year blending into the next. This is your life now, not the glorious adventure of knights and ladies that minstrels sing about, but the gritty, cold reality of what actually kept those stone fortresses functioning, the untold story of the men who watched and waited and endured, who lived and died in obscurity on castle walls throughout medieval Europe. The wind picks up, carrying the first hint of approaching rain. You pull your cloak tighter, squint against the darkness, and continue your endless vigil. Just another night in the life of a medieval castle guard. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the walls, unknown to you, riders approach. Torches will soon appear on the horizon. The alarm bell will sound. Your moment of truth will arrive with the dawn. But for now, there is only you, the wind, and the weight of duty on your shoulders. The true, unglamorous face of medieval security, standing watch throughout the long night of history. Why it sucked to be a medieval castle guard and more. Part 2. Dawn breaks over the castle walls, painting the stone in deceptive gold that makes it look almost welcoming. You've been awake for over 18 hours now, your eyes burning, your legs trembling with fatigue beneath your mail hauberk. The riders you spotted in the night turned out to be nothing more than merchants seeking early entry, but your captain made you finish your watch anyway. Better alert than dead, he grunted, before disappearing back to his slightly more comfortable quarters. As you finally trudge down the worn stone steps, your replacement already taking your position with fresh eyes and marginally more energy, you're faced with the grim reality that has become your daily existence. Your stomach growls painfully. You missed the evening meal yesterday because of an extended patrol, and the morning porridge will be nearly gone by the time you reach the kitchens. This is the rhythm of guard life. Always slightly hungry, perpetually exhausted, and somehow expected to maintain vigilance that could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds. Let's talk about those wounds and injuries that came with the job, the ones that didn't kill you outright, but made sure you remembered them every day. Castle guards weren't just at risk during active sieges or raids. The daily routine itself was a gauntlet of potential injuries, many of which would leave you permanently marked, if not disabled. Those stone steps you navigate multiple times daily, worn smooth by thousands of feet, over decades, often wet from rain or condensation, poorly lit even during daytime. Falls were common, resulting in broken bones, cracked skulls, or worse. A senior guard who'd survived 2 sieges might be felled by a simple misstep on a dark stairwell. Stairback, they called it, the particular hunched posture of veteran guards whose spines had been damaged by falls or by years of carrying heavy equipment up and down castle stairs. You could spot the old-timers by their gait alone, shuffling slightly, unable to fully straighten. The equipment itself was another source of chronic injury. Mail armor, when worn for 12-hour shifts, day after day, created its own special torments. The weight, often upwards of 30 pounds, distributed unevenly across shoulders and hips, led to persistent pain and eventual deformity. Chain shoulder was nearly universal among career guards. Permanently stooped posture, one shoulder typically lower than the other, from supporting a mail shirt along with weapons. The constant chafing, where metal rings rubbed against cloth and skin, left circular scarring patterns that marked a guard as surely as any uniform. Helmets, essential for protection, brought their own problems. Hours of wearing a metal cap constricted blood flow, causing headaches so severe that some guards would risk punishment by removing them during quiet watches. The padding inside, rarely cleaned and constantly damp with sweat, became a breeding ground for lice, fungal infections, and painful skin conditions. Helmet head, with its distinctive ring of sores and baldness around the brow, was a common sight when guards removed their headgear in private. Some developed permanent indentations in their skulls from years of pressure. Weapons training and patrol accidents claimed fingers, eyes, and teeth with grim regularity. Practice with polearms, crossbows, and swords was necessary but dangerous, especially when conducted by exhausted men in crowded conditions. A moment's inattention during a standard drill could cost you digits or leave you with a facial scar that would mark you for life. One of your bunkmates, Roderick, carries his own reminder of such training: a missing left eye, courtesy of a splintered practice lance 3 summers ago. He's actually one of the lucky ones. The castle lord kept him on out of recognition for his 5 years of prior service. Many guards with similar injuries simply found themselves dismissed, their positions filled by intact replacements. "Count your scars, not your years," goes an old guard saying. "Your body keeps the tally, even when your mind forgets." Feet and hands suffered particularly. Guards on wall duty remained standing for hours in hall weather, their extremities exposed to extreme conditions. Chilblains, trench foot, and frostbite were seasonal expectations, not exceptional occurrences. Circulation problems became permanent after a few winters on the walls. "Look at these," says Aldwin, a 50-year veteran, displaying his gnarled hands by torchlight one evening. His fingers are permanently curled, knuckles swollen to painful knots, nails thickened and yellow. Can't straighten them anymore, not even in summer, but they still hold a spear, and that's all the captain cares about. The castle's resident healer, sometimes a monk with rudimentary medical knowledge, sometimes just an old soldier who'd seen enough wounds to recognize infection, offered little beyond basic poultices, bloodletting, or in extreme cases, amputation. Guards learned to treat themselves and each other, using folk remedies passed down through generations of watchmen: willow bark tea for pain, moldy bread pressed into festering wounds, cauterization with red-hot knife blades for persistent bleeding, urine-soaked bandages when clean cloth was unavailable. Medicine in a medieval castle was equal parts superstition, desperation, and occasional accidental effectiveness. Broken bones, poorly set if set at all, meant lifelong disability. That distinctive limp seen in so many older guards, usually a leg or ankle fracture that healed badly, leaving them with chronic pain and limited mobility. Yet as long as they could stand their watch, no one much cared about their discomfort. Beyond the physical wounds lay the invisible ones. What we now recognize as psychological trauma was simply part of a guard's existence, unmarked and untreated. Witnessing violent deaths, experiencing the horrors of siege warfare, living with constant hypervigilance, all left scars that no medieval healer could identify, let alone address. Night terrors, they called it, when a guard woke screaming, convinced he was back in the desperate hours of a castle assault. Or battle shakes, when hands trembled too badly to hold a cup, despite no obvious injury. Some turned to heavy drinking to quiet these invisible torments. Others simply disappeared one day, their posts abandoned, their fate unknown, and largely unquestioned. The psychological burden of responsibility, knowing that a moment's inattention could mean death for everyone within the walls, wore on the mind as surely as mail wore on the shoulders. The crushing weight of this duty broke men in ways that left no visible mark but rendered them just as damaged. You've seen it in the 1,000-yard stare of veterans who survived brutal sieges, in the obsessive checking and rechecking of defenses by guards who've experienced a successful enemy infiltration. These men carry the fortress not just on their backs, but in their minds, unable to set down the burden, even in sleep. The worst injuries, ironically, weren't always those sustained in dramatic combat. It was the slow, accumulative damage that truly defined a guard's experience. Bodies weren't broken in glorious battle, so much as worn down by relentless routine, chronic exposure, inadequate rest, poor nutrition, and constant stress. By 40, if you survived that long, your body had effectively aged to 60. By 50, you were ancient, your frame a catalog of pain, your movement a study in careful compensation for weakened joints and damaged tissue. The miracle wasn't that so few guards reached old age. It was that any did at all. And still, you stand your watch. What choice do you have? The alternative is starvation, or banditry, or begging. At least the castle walls offer some protection, meager rations, and the cold comfort of purpose. Your broken body is the price you pay. Installments collected daily in aches, scars, and gradually diminishing capability. The politics of castle life added another layer of misery to a guard's existence. Medieval fortresses weren't just military installations. They were complex social ecosystems with hierarchies, factions, and power struggles that could prove just as dangerous as any external enemy. As a common guard, you occupied one of the lowest rungs on this social ladder, despite your essential role in castle security. Noble visitors barely registered your existence. Knights and men-at-arms viewed you with mild contempt, considering guard duty beneath their martial dignity. Household servants might be technically lower in status, but often enjoyed better conditions and closer proximity to the nobility's favor. We're like the castle walls, old Aldwin likes to say, between swigs of sour ale. Everyone needs us. No one notices us until we fail, and then we bear the full weight of blame. The command structure above you was its own special torment. The typical castle guard answered to multiple masters, each with their own priorities and demands. The captain of the guard, usually a veteran soldier or minor nobleman, oversaw day-to-day operations and duty assignments. The master-at-arms handled training and equipment. The castle constable held ultimate responsibility for security. But that was just the beginning. The steward might draft guards for escort duty or special tasks. The chamberlain could requisition guards for ceremonial functions. Individual, noble household members might issue direct orders when it suited them. Visiting dignitaries often arrived with their own security demands. This tangled web of authority created endless opportunities for conflicting orders, impossible expectations, and situations where obeying one superior meant defying another. Guards caught in these contradictions rarely received sympathy from any quarter. The Lord says, "Hold the gate." The steward says, "Open it for the grain wagons." The captain's not here to ask. "Make the wrong choice. It's your head," mutters Edgar, a square-built guard with a perpetual scowl. Meanwhile, none of them has stood night watch in the rain, even once. Guard captains themselves ranged from capable leaders who looked after their men to petty tyrants who abused their authority at every turn. The good ones, typically promoted from the ranks after years of service, understood the challenges of the job and worked to mitigate its worst aspects. They arranged reasonable rotations, ensured fair distribution of rations, and advocated for their guards when possible. The bad ones turned guard life into pure misery. Some were nobles, with no practical experience, appointed through family connections rather than merit. Others were former soldiers who believed extreme discipline was the only path to security. The worst combined incompetence with cruelty, issuing impossible orders, then punishing guards for failing to execute them. Captain Reynard, your current commander, falls somewhere in the middle, competent enough in military matters, but utterly indifferent to the welfare of his men. He views guards as interchangeable parts in the castle machinery, to be used until broken and then replaced without sentiment. Two types of captains, Aldwin explains during a rare rest period. Those who know guard work and those who think they know. Pray for the first kind, survive the second. Corruption infested the ranks as well. Senior guards often demanded bribes from juniors for favorable shift assignments or better equipment. Captains might skim from supply allotments, selling the difference for personal profit. Guards themselves supplemented meager wages through petty extortion, charging for entry, after hours, or losing mandatory inspections for the right price. Many castle lords tacitly permitted such practices, viewing them as an unofficial supplement to the low wages they paid. Others punished corruption severely when discovered, not necessarily from moral objection, but because it represented a potential security risk. Being caught could mean dismissal, flogging, or even hanging, depending on the offense and the lord's temperament. The real danger, however, lay in the factional politics that plagued most castle households. Medieval power was rarely monolithic. Even in seemingly stable fortresses, competing interests constantly maneuvered for advantage, using guards as both pawns and prizes in their games. Consider the classic tension between the constable and the steward, one responsible for military security, the other for household administration. Their jurisdictions inevitably overlapped, creating constant friction. Guards often found themselves caught between contradictory orders, with their primary loyalty supposedly to the constable, but their daily activities frequently directed by the steward's office. Half my duties have nothing to do with guarding anything, complains Geralt, a lanky guard with a perpetual cough. Escort this merchant, carry that chest, stand decoratively at this feast. The steward treats us like servants, with weapons. When castle lords were absent, a common occurrence given the itinerant nature of medieval nobility, these factional conflicts intensified. The lord's wife might have her own priorities, his adult children, their own ambitions, his relatives, their own grievances. Senior officials jockeyed for influence, and guards became both instruments and obstacles in these subtle power struggles. Loyalty became a dangerous commodity. Align yourself too closely with one faction, and you risked retribution if their fortunes fell. Remain strictly neutral, and you might miss opportunities for better conditions or advancement. The safest path was careful, calculating loyalty to the office rather than the individual, to the captaincy rather than the captain, to the lordship rather than the lord. Information was currency in this environment, and guards were uniquely positioned to acquire it. Your watch stations placed you where conversations could be overheard, movements observed, patterns detected. This made you valuable to those playing political games, and dangerous to those being observed. A guard with loose lips is worth 2 spies, goes the saying. Those who sold information could gain significant advantages, better assignments, extra rations, even modest bribes. But the risk was commensurately high. Being caught as an informant meant losing trust from all quarters, a potentially fatal position in the closed environment of a castle. Some guards navigated these treacherous waters successfully, building networks of patronage that provided some insulation against the worst aspects of the job. Others found themselves sacrificed in power plays beyond their understanding, dismissed or even imprisoned for following orders that later became politically inconvenient. "Remember, Willem?" Aldwin asks one night, his voice low despite the empty guard room. 15 years on the walls. Never a complaint. Then he reported Lord Geoffrey's second son, returning after curfew with blood on his clothes, just as he was sworn to do. Week later, Willem's accused of stealing from the armory. Next day, he's gone. Convenient. That. The most dangerous time for castle guards was during transitions of power. When lords died or were replaced, when captains changed or constables fell from favor, the entire security apparatus became vulnerable. New masters meant new loyalties, new expectations, and often a purge of those too closely associated with the previous regime. Guards who survived such transitions learned to make themselves useful, but not essential, loyal, but not devoted, present, but not memorable. The ability to fade into the stones while still performing one's duties became a survival skill, as important as swordsmanship or vigilance. You've begun to develop this skill yourself, carefully balancing between visibility when it serves you and invisibility when it doesn't. You've learned when to speak and when to stand silent, when to remember details and when to conveniently forget them. It's exhausting, this constant calculation, but necessary in an environment where political missteps can be as fatal as military ones. And through it all, you stand your watch. Politics may swirl within the walls like winter wind, but the primary reality remains unchanged. Someone must walk the battlements. Someone must watch the gates. Someone must be the first to die if enemies come. That someone is you, regardless of which faction currently holds sway in the Lord's Council. Perhaps the most feared aspect of a guard's life, the experience that haunted nightmares and dominated fireside conversations, was the siege. Nothing tested the limits of human endurance or revealed the true nature of castle society, like being trapped inside walls while a determined enemy tried to break through, starve you out, or simply outlast your will to resist. Most guards might go their entire careers without experiencing a full siege. Border skirmishes, bandit raids, and brief assaults were far more common, but the possibility of siege shaped everything about castle life and guard duty. It was the ultimate scenario for which all security measures were designed, the final exam that would test every aspect of your training and preparation. When word came of approaching enemies in sufficient numbers to attempt a siege, the entire castle transformed. Gates were secured, livestock driven inside, water sources protected, food stockpiled, additional guards were posted, watches doubled, training intensified. The atmosphere changed from routine vigilance to heightened alertness, tinged with the particular dread that comes from knowing you're about to be trapped with no escape. Prey in a box is how Edgar describes it. They're out there, free to move. We're in here, waiting to see if they're patient enough to starve us or angry enough to try climbing the walls. Neither's pleasant to think about. The initial phase of a siege often involved a demonstration of force. Enemies parading their numbers, showcasing siege equipment, making demands for surrender. This psychological warfare was aimed as much at the defenders' morale as at their physical defenses. Guards on the walls had front row positions for these intimidation tactics, absorbing the full impact of threats, both explicit and implied. If the castle refused surrender, as most did initially at least, the siege began in earnest. First came probing attacks, testing defenses, looking for weaknesses. Guards faced constant alert status, sleep deprivation, becoming even more extreme than usual. A typical defensive rotation might allow only 3 or 4 hours of rest between 12-hour watches. You start seeing things that aren't there around the third day, says Walter, a red-bearded guard with a reputation for unflappability. Shadows moving in the tree line, figures climbing walls that are clear as day. Your mind plays tricks when it's tired enough. These hallucinations weren't just disconcerting, they were dangerous. False alarms drained energy and resources. Missed signals could mean disaster. Guard captains developed systems of verification, requiring multiple observers to confirm suspicious activity before sounding general alarms. But the fundamental problem remained. Exhausted men make unreliable witnesses. As sieges progressed, conditions within the castle deteriorated. Food rationing began immediately, but grew more severe as weeks passed. Guards, despite their essential role, rarely received preferential treatment. Your rations might be reduced to a single daily meal of thin porridge and hard bread, barely enough to maintain consciousness, let alone strength. Water became precious, especially if the castle relied on external sources that enemies could contaminate or divert. Guards on the walls, exposed to sun and wind, suffered particularly from thirst. Dehydration compounded fatigue, leading to impaired judgment precisely when clear thinking was most essential. Sanitation collapsed quickly in siege conditions. Waste disposal systems designed for normal occupancy couldn't handle the increased population of refugees from surrounding lands who typically sheltered within castle walls. Disease spread rapidly in these crowded, unsanitary conditions. More men lost to flux than arrows in the Harlow siege, Aldwin recalls grimly. Couldn't leave your post even to relieve yourself properly. Men soiling their armor rather than abandon the wall. Dysentery tore through the ranks like wildfire. Injuries during sieges created another layer of misery. Medical supplies dwindled quickly, leaving guards with minimal treatment options. Wounds that might be survivable under normal circumstances became death sentences due to infection and inadequate care. The castle's usual healer, overwhelmed with casualties, had little time for non-critical injuries. Got this during the McDuncan siege, says Roderick, displaying a jagged scar running from elbow to wrist. Arrow grazed me on the second day. By the fifth, the wound was green and stinking. Thought they'd take the arm for certain. Only saved it because the old herb woman had a poultice of moldy bread and honey. Hurt worse than the arrow, but I kept the limb if the siege progressed to active assault. Ladders against walls, battering rams at gates, tunnels beneath foundations. Guards formed the front line of defense, fighting from the advantageous height of walls and towers. They still faced terrible odds and horrific casualties. This wasn't the noble combat of knightly duels, but desperate, brutal fighting in cramped conditions with limited visibility. They came over the north wall just before dawn, Walter recounts, his voice dropping to a near whisper. 30, maybe 40 of them. We were 7 guards on that section, half asleep despite our best efforts. The fighting, it wasn't fighting as such, just killing, stabbing, no room to swing properly, no time to think, just bodies pressed together, everyone trying to stay alive one more minute. The psychological impact of these experiences left permanent scars. Some guards developed a fatalistic calm, a resignation to whatever might come. Others manifested increasing anxiety, jumping at shadows, unable to sleep even during designated rest periods. Many turned to whatever intoxicants were available, alcohol if lucky, various herbal concoctions. When desperate, siege sickness, they called the particular vacant stare that overtook some men after weeks under these conditions, a detachment from reality, a retreat into some inner space where the constant threat, noise, and horror couldn't reach. Those who succumbed completely were usually removed from duty, though what happened to them afterward went unspoken. If the castle held and the siege was eventually lifted, whether through successful defense, external relief forces, or negotiated withdrawal, the aftermath brought its own challenges. Guards who had survived often found themselves dealing with conflicting emotions, relief at having endured, grief for lost comrades, lingering hypervigilance that made returning to normal routines difficult. Won 3 sieges in my time, Aldwin says, staring into his cup. Each victory felt smaller than the last. First time, we celebrated for days. By the third, we just buried our dead and repaired the walls. No joy in it, just work to be done before the next one came. For those unfortunates in castles that fell to siege, the outcomes varied widely, depending on the attacker's temperament and objectives. Sometimes surrendered defenders were treated honorably, allowed to leave with personal possessions. Occasionally, even offered service under the new occupiers. Other times, especially when resistance had been fierce or prolonged, the consequences were brutal. My first post was at Ravensford Keep, says Edgar during a rare moment of openness, held for 26 days against Lord Brackwell's forces after our lord refused to swear fealty to the new king. When the east wall finally fell, they gave no quarter. Every man wearing our colors was put to the sword, guards and knights alike. I only survived by stripping my surcoat and hiding among the servants. His eyes take on that distant look of men, recounting events they've spent years trying to forget. They mounted our captain's head on the gatehouse spike, left it there till the crows took the last of him. Such stories circulated among guards across regions, reinforcing both the importance of their role and the potentially dire consequences of failure. Most castle guards lived with the knowledge that they might someday face similar circumstances, trapped within the very walls they'd sworn to defend, waiting to discover whether they'd be among the survivors or the examples. And yet, despite these horrors, or perhaps because of them, sieges created a particular bond among those who endured them together. Guards who stood shoulder to shoulder during such extreme conditions developed a camaraderie that transcended normal social barriers. The shared experience of surviving when many didn't forged connections that often lasted lifetimes. Men I served with at Highcrest during the 3-month siege, Aldwin reflects, I'd still die for any of them today, 20 years on. Don't need to speak of what happened there. They know. I know. That's enough. This siege brotherhood sometimes provided the only real community guards ever knew. Families might not understand what they'd experienced. Civilian friends couldn't comprehend the particular pressures of their role. Only fellow guards, particularly those who'd shared the same sieges, truly knew what it meant to stand watch, not knowing if the next hour would bring boredom or slaughter. For most castle guards, social status was another source of constant frustration. You occupied an ambiguous middle ground in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, neither truly military elite, like knights, nor domestic servants, neither skilled craftsmen, nor common laborers. Guards were essential to castle function, yet rarely acknowledged as such. The typical guard came from humble origins, younger sons of peasant families, former foot soldiers, occasionally urban poor, seeking steady employment. A few might be failed squires or disgraced lesser nobles, but most began with minimal social standing and found that guard service did little to elevate their position. Within the castle community, your status depended largely on specific assignment and length of service. Gate guards interacted regularly with visitors and merchants, giving them slightly more visibility and opportunity for small bribes or favors. Wall sentries remained largely anonymous, their faces unfamiliar even to castle residents they protected. Personal guards assigned to noble family members might gain proximity to power, though rarely any significant influence. 20 years I've watched Lord Haviland's back, says Thomas, a square-faced veteran with a carefully maintained mustache. Stood behind his chair at council meetings, guarded his door while he slept, followed 3 paces behind on hunts and journeys. Man wouldn't recognize me if we passed on the street without my uniform. That's how it is. Interactions with the noble family generally ranged from indifference to contempt. Most lords viewed guards as necessary equipment rather than people, functional objects that happened to breathe. Ladies might be somewhat more acknowledging, particularly of guards who showed respectful competence, but the gulf in status remained unbridgeable. Lady Elise knows my name, says Geralt with obvious pride. Asked after my mother when she was ill last winter. Doesn't sound like much, but in this place, it's rare enough to mention. Knights and men-at-arms, theoretically fellow defenders of the castle, often treated guards with barely disguised disdain. In their view, guard duty lacked the glory and skill of proper warfare. Standing watch required endurance rather than prowess, vigilance rather than valor. This created a perpetual tension between the castle's permanent security force and its martial elite. Sir Roderick and his kind, spits Edgar, during an off-duty drinking session, prancing about in polished armor, training in the yard 3 hours a day, then retiring to the hall for wine and boasting. Meanwhile, we're standing 16-hour watches in the rain, but let one enemy appear on the horizon, and suddenly, they're the heroes, while we're just the backdrop for their gallantry. Household servants presented a more complex relationship. On paper, guards outranked domestic staff, but the reality was more nuanced. Servants, particularly those who attended noble family members directly, often enjoyed better treatment, better food, and more comfortable accommodations than guards. More importantly, they had daily personal contact with the power center of castle life, giving them influence disproportionate to their official status. Cook won't serve me the fresh bread when I come off night watch, complains a young guard named Perrin. Says it's reserved for the Lord's table. Same cook who slips extra portions to the lady's handmaid because she puts in a good word with her mistress. It's all about who speaks to who, not what your actual position is. Relationships between guards and castle servants could be collaborative or competitive, depending on personalities and circumstances. Smart guards cultivated friendships with key household staff, cooks who might set aside extra rations, laundresses who would give priority to soaked uniforms, stewards who could assign more comfortable quarters. These informal alliances made life marginally more bearable. Merchants, tradespeople, and regular visitors to the castle formed another social sphere with which guards interacted daily. These relationships were often transactional. Guards controlled access, checked credentials, and maintained security, creating natural opportunities for both conflict and cooperation. The ale merchant slips me a flask every third delivery, confides Geralt. Not as a bribe, I'd inspect his wagons anyway, but because I once spotted a broken axle before it gave way completely, saved him a spilled load and a month's profits. Small kindnesses get remembered. Local villagers and peasants from surrounding lands viewed castle guards with a mixture of respect, resentment, and occasionally fear. Guards represented authority, protection, and sometimes oppression, depending on how the local lord governed. During periods of unrest or harsh rule, guards might find themselves enforcing unpopular policies, straining community relations. Had to oversee grain collection last harvest, Roderick recalls grimly. Lord raised the portion by a third after the neighboring villages revolted. Families watching us cart away food they needed for winter, children crying from hunger already. We were just following orders, but try telling that to a starving man watching his children's food leave on castle wagons. For most guards, the social isolation of their position became a defining feature of existence. Not quite soldiers, not quite servants, not respected professionals, nor completely unskilled laborers. They occupied a liminal space that offered neither the camaraderie of military life nor the integration of civilian community. Off-duty socialization typically happened among fellow guards, creating a closed circle that reinforced this isolation. Local taverns might welcome guard patronage, particularly on paydays, but meaningful connections outside the profession remained rare. Many guards lived entire careers within this bubble, their world consisting primarily of the walls they patrolled, and the men who shared that duty. Had a wife once, back in Millerton, says Walter with uncharacteristic openness. Couldn't stand it after 2 years. The irregular hours, the constant exhaustion, coming home too tired to speak, let alone be a proper husband. Can't blame her for leaving. This job doesn't leave room for much else. Family life was particularly difficult to maintain while serving as a castle guard. Irregular schedules, frequent overnight duties, and limited leave made consistent home presence nearly impossible. Those who managed to have families typically saw them infrequently, becoming something between visiting strangers and occasional providers, rather than daily participants in household life. Guards with quarters inside the castle walls might go weeks without seeing their families in nearby villages. Those fortunate enough to have family housing within the outer bailey or castle town enjoyed more regular contact, but still struggled with the demands of their schedule. Many simply remained unmarried, finding companionship in brief encounters or resigning themselves to effective solitude. My boys are 8 and 10, says Thomas, barely know me, except as the tired man who appears occasionally with a bit of castle bread or a copper coin. Their mothers raised them more with tales of what I do than with my actual presence. Strange to be a legend in your own home instead of a father. The combination of social isolation, low status, and difficult working conditions created a particular psychology among career guards, a certain fatalism, a grim humor, a detachment that protected against constant disappointment. Expectations remained deliberately low. Small comforts gained disproportionate importance. Present concerns overrode any long-term planning. Guard thinking, Aldwin calls it. Never count on tomorrow, because tomorrow might bring a ladder against your wall section. Never expect praise, because the best you'll get is not being noticed. Never hope for more, because this job hasn't changed in 500 years and won't change for another 500. Yet despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, castle guards developed their own culture, traditions, and identity. They created meaning within constraints, purpose within limitation, pride within thanklessness. The profession carried its own code, unwritten, but understood by all who wore the uniform. Watch faithfully, warn promptly, fight if necessary, die in place if required. Simple directives that nonetheless contained a certain dignity, a recognition that their role, however unglamorous, remained essential to the entire social order that overlooked them. The stones don't hold back enemies, Aldwin tells new recruits during informal evening conversations. Men do. Remember that when the rain's soaking through your cloak and your feet are blocks of ice, it's not the wall that keeps them out. It's you, standing on it. Small rituals marked guard life. The ceremonial changing of the watch, the passing of sentry passwords, the traditional toasts in guard barracks. Veterans taught newcomers not just practical skills, but the unwritten history of their post. Which sections of wall were vulnerable during storms? Which tower stairs had loose stones? Which noble family members might acknowledge a respectful greeting, and which would report perceived impertinence? 3 things make a guard, goes an old saying: sharp eyes, strong legs, and a closed mouth. The wisdom of experience distilled into practical philosophy, passed from generation to generation, of men who stood the same watches, walked the same walls, faced the same challenges across centuries. In rare quiet moments, when watches aligned and duty permitted, older guards sometimes shared stories of notable events, remarkable siege defenses, or particularly respected captains from decades past. This oral tradition preserved institutional memory beyond any official records, creating a sense of continuity and shared identity that transcended individual service. Old Captain Durham during the river floods of '86, Aldwin recounts to attentive younger guards. Water rose faster than anyone expected. Lower Bailey completely submerged by midnight. He organized us into rescue teams, saved 27 lives, including the brewer's entire family, from the rising waters. Never got so much as a nod from the Lord, but we remember, always name a firstborn son Durham in guard families, even now, 40 years on. These stories, whether strictly accurate or enhanced through retelling, served important functions. They provided models of exemplary conduct, illustrated practical problem solving, and most importantly, placed individual guards within a larger historical continuum. Your suffering wasn't unique. Your service wasn't isolated. You were part of something that stretched backward through time and would continue long after you were gone. This sense of identity, however limited in scope and recognition, offered some compensation for the profession's many hardships. Guard service might not bring status, wealth, comfort, or glory, but it provided belonging, purpose, and a place within a tradition that valued exactly the qualities society at large overlooked: reliability, vigilance, consistency, endurance. We're the Stone Men, Aldwin says, using the nickname both guards and others applied to the profession. Not just because we watch from the walls, but because we're like the stones themselves, weathered, worn, overlooked, but ultimately what everything else rests upon. Take away the stones, the whole castle falls. Remember that on the cold nights when no one sees you keeping watch. A meaningful sentiment, perhaps. Cold comfort on a winter night when sleet drives horizontally through arrow slits and your relief watch is running late again. But comfort, nonetheless, and in a medieval guard's life, any comfort was valuable beyond measure. Dawn is breaking now, painting the eastern sky in reluctant gray. You've survived another night on the walls. No enemy approached, no disaster struck, no alarm needed sounding. An unremarkable watch, the kind that fills most of a guard's life, dangerous only in its tedium, its invitation to lapsed attention, its slow erosion of vigilance through sheer repetition of nothing happening. You straighten your back, ignoring the familiar pain where mail has dug into your shoulders for hours. Soon your replacement will arrive, and you can seek a few hours of sleep before afternoon duties begin. Your stomach growls, reminding you that the kitchen might have scraps left if you hurry. Your eyes burn with fatigue. Your feet throb within damp boots. Your mind feels wrapped in wool after another night of fighting sleep. Just another day in the life of a medieval castle guard. Unglamorous, unrecognized, unrelenting. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses as the golden hour of evening approaches, painting the castle. Stones in deceptively warm hues, You find yourself back on the western wall, spear in hand, eyes scanning the thickening shadows beneath the tree line. Your few hours of rest passed in what felt like moments, your body still aching from the previous watch, the taste of watery gruel lingering unpleasantly in your mouth. This is your life now, an endless cycle of watches, brief respites that never truly refresh, and the constant, gnawing awareness that your vigilance is all that stands between safety and catastrophe. Tonight, we'll explore the special hell that was night duty, perhaps the most dreaded aspect of a castle guard's existence. When darkness fell, everything changed. The familiar landscape transformed into a threatening void, filled with imagined dangers and very real vulnerabilities. Night watch wasn't just uncomfortable, it was terrifying in ways that daylight patrols could never match. The transition from day to night in a medieval castle wasn't the simple flip of electric lights we take for granted today. It was a gradual dimming, a surrendering of visibility, a retreat into shadow pierced only by scattered torches and the occasional oil lamp. As the sun set, the world contracted. Where once you could see for miles from your watchtower, now your vision extended only as far as firelight reached, perhaps 20 paces at most, often less in fog or rain. Night blindness, the veterans called it. Not just the physical limitation of human eyes in darkness, but the psychological burden of knowing danger could approach unseen. The pressure of staring into darkness, hour after hour, imagining movement in every shifting shadow, was enough to break even strong minds over time. First rule of night watch, Aldwin told you during your earliest training. Don't trust your eyes. They'll lie to you. Tree branches become climbing men. Deer at the forest edge become advancing soldiers. Your mind fills the darkness with whatever you fear most. Instead, experienced guards developed other senses, the subtle sounds of armored men trying to move quietly, the pattern of nocturnal animal noises suddenly going silent when disturbed, the distinctive smell of horses, cook fires, or men in large numbers carried on night breezes. These became more reliable indicators than sight alone. But these heightened senses brought their own torment. Every snap of a twig in the forest became a potential infiltrator. Every owl's cry might mask an enemy signal. Every shift in wind could carry the scent of approaching danger, or simply be the weather changing. The mental strain of this constant evaluation, this perpetual state of alertness, wore guards down far faster than a physical exertion ever could. 3 nights running on the West Tower nearly broke me, confesses Perrin, the young guard who joined your unit last winter. Started seeing faces in the darkness by the 2nd night. By the 3rd, I was having conversations with them. Captain found me at dawn, talking to a shadow I was convinced was my childhood friend from the village. The captain hadn't punished him. Such experiences were too common among night guards to merit discipline. Instead, they'd rotated him to gate duty for a week, allowing his mind to recover before sending him back to the darkness. Not out of kindness, you understood, but practicality. A guard who permanently lost his grip on reality was of no use to anyone. Night duty wasn't just mentally challenging, it was physically punishing in unique ways. The temperature drop after sunset could be brutal, especially in autumn and winter. Stone walls that absorbed heat during daylight became radiators of cold after dark, drawing warmth from your body as you stood your post. Wind that merely annoyed during day watch cut through clothing at night, finding every gap in your tunic, every loose seam in your cloak. Layer everything, advises Edgar, demonstrating how he wears 2 tunics beneath his mail, stuffs his boots with straw for insulation, and wraps his hands in strips of wool beneath leather gloves. Still won't keep you warm, but might prevent your fingers from dropping off by morning. Dampness was particularly treacherous at night. Dew forming on the metal surfaces made handrails, weapon hilts, and mail armor dangerously slick. Fog reduced visibility to arm's length, creating blind spots that could conceal entire raiding parties. Rain, always miserable, became actively dangerous in darkness, turning stone steps into death traps and making footing uncertain on narrow walkways. The worst nights combined all these elements: cold, wet darkness that penetrated body and mind, creating conditions where staying alert became a battle against your own suffering. Guards developed countless small strategies to combat these challenges, shifting weight constantly to maintain circulation, silently reciting prayers or ballads to stay mentally present, subtle movements and stretches that provided minimal warmth without abandoning watchfulness. Count the stars on clear nights, suggests Walter, his face illuminated by torchlight during a rare break between watches. Pick a section of sky and count each one you can see. Then pick another section. Keeps your mind working without distracting you from your duty. On cloudy nights, count your heartbeats instead. These techniques weren't just about comfort. They were survival strategies. A guard who succumbed to cold might fall asleep standing up, a potentially fatal lapse. One who lost focus might miss crucial warning signs of approach. One who panicked at imagined threats might sound false alarms that weakened the castle's readiness for real danger. Night watch created another unique peril: the heightened risk of accidents. Stone stairs, worn smooth by centuries of boots, became treacherous obstacle courses in near darkness. Uneven walkways along curtain walls, hazardous even in daylight, became potentially lethal paths after sunset. Torch brackets, arrow loops, merlins, and crenels, all familiar features by day, transformed into shadowy hazards, waiting to catch an unwary hand or foot. Lost 3 men in my first year as captain, remembers the grizzled commander of the night watch, a man named Harrow, whose face bears scars from some long-ago battle. Not to enemies, to falls. One slipped on icy steps, another leaned too far over a parapet, checking something he thought he saw. A third simply vanished during heavy fog, found his body in the inner bailey the next morning, neck broken from the fall. He taps the rope all night guards now wear tied around their waists. Started requiring these after that. Doesn't stop falls, but at least we can find the bodies more easily. His gallows humor masks a genuine innovation. The safety line that night guards on particularly exposed positions, attached to secure points, preventing fatal falls when footing fails. It's a small comfort, but characteristic of how guard tradition evolves. Through blood and loss, each tragedy potentially preventing future ones through the lessons it teaches. The darkness brought psychological torments beyond simple fear or discomfort. Night shifts disrupted natural sleep patterns, creating a perpetual state of exhaustion that medieval guards had no scientific framework to understand. They couldn't name concepts like circadian rhythm or sleep deprivation, but they lived with their effects every day. Your body never truly adjusts, Aldwin explains, his eyes sunken from decades of irregular sleep. Mine still thinks I should rest when it's dark, wake when it's light, even after all these years of doing the opposite. You learn to sleep when permitted, not when natural. This forced adaptation created chronic health problems unique to night guards. Digestive issues plagued many, their bodies confused by meals taken at irregular hours. Headaches became so common, they were simply accepted as part of the job. Vision problems developed over years of straining to see in inadequate light. Memory lapses, mood disturbances, and a general shortening of temper marked the veterans of extended night duty. More serious conditions emerged over time. Guards who spent years on night rotation often developed a persistent cough from breathing cold, damp air for hours on end. Joint pain became more severe than in day guards, the cold seemingly penetrating into bones themselves. Some experienced a gradual deterioration in thinking, becoming forgetful, confused, or irrationally fearful after decades of darkness duty. Lantern sickness. Older guards called this constellation of symptoms, attributing them to the poor quality of air around oil lamps and torches rather than the true causes of sleep disruption and environmental exposure. Whatever the name, the effects were real and often debilitating, forcing many guards into early retirement if they lived long enough to show symptoms. The social isolation of night duty added another layer of misery. While day guards at least interacted with castle inhabitants, merchants, and visitors, night guards existed in a shadow world, often seeing only their immediate colleagues for days at a time. They slept while others socialized, worked while others rested, creating a disconnection from normal castle life that fostered a distinct subculture among night watch personnel. "We're the bats," jokes Garrett, a lean guard with unusually good night vision who has spent most of his 15 years of service on darkness rotation. Creatures of the night, unwelcome in daylight, misunderstood by those who've never lived our hours. We even hang upside down to sleep. He grins at this last fabrication, but the sentiment behind it is genuine. Night guards often felt like different species from their daylight counterparts. This separation created both challenges and opportunities. Night guards typically developed stronger bonds with their direct colleagues, relying on each other not just for physical security, but for psychological support. Conversations during quiet periods of watch became deeper, more philosophical, perhaps because darkness encourages confidences, or perhaps simply because the night hours stretched so endlessly that eventually all trivial topics were exhausted. "Know more about Roderick's childhood than his wife does," Walter comments during a pre-dawn meal break. When you've stood 30 night watches with a man, you've either talked about everything or killed each other from boredom. Yet this closeness came at the cost of a broader connection. Night guards often became strangers to their own families, missing meals, celebrations, and ordinary moments of life. Their children grew accustomed to a father who was always sleeping during daylight hours, always leaving as the sun set. Their wives effectively managed households alone, some eventually finding companionship elsewhere, when marriage became nothing more than occasional intersections of conflicting schedules. "My first wife left after 3 years of night rotation," shares Harrow, the night captain. "Second one lasted 5. Current one was a tavern keeper's daughter, already understood irregular hours. 20 years together now." His tone suggests this third marriage succeeds not through passion, but through lowered expectations, a pragmatic arrangement between two people who understand the limitations night work imposes. The supernatural dimensions of night duty added yet another layer of stress. Medieval people lived in a world they believed was populated by spirits, demons, ghosts, and otherworldly entities that gained power after sunset. For guards already straining to distinguish real threats from shadows, these cultural beliefs created additional psychological burden. Many castle walls bore small shrines or protective symbols specifically to guard against nocturnal spirits. Night watches typically began with specific prayers for spiritual protection, regardless of how hardened or cynical the guards might be in other matters. Few would openly admit to believing in haunts and specters, yet most practiced some private ritual or carried some charm against the darkness. "Mock all you want in daylight," Aldwin advises, showing you the small wooden cross he wears beneath his tunic. But stand enough midnights on the North Tower, hear enough sounds you can't explain, see enough movements that shouldn't be possible, and you'll find something to hold on to. Might be the Virgin, might be older protections, doesn't matter what. Just need something. The most feared duty among night guards was the solitary watch, posts distant enough from the main castle that no immediate support was available if trouble arose. Signal towers on remote parts of the estate, gatehouse watch during peacetime, patrol routes along outer walls. These assignments required guards to face the darkness entirely alone, sometimes for hours without human contact. Hardest part isn't the potential danger, explains Walter, who handles solitary posts better than most. It's the silence. Your mind fills it with whispers, conversations, sounds that aren't there. By the third hour, you're talking to yourself just to hear a human voice. By the fifth, you're answering. These isolated positions created psychological challenges even the strongest guards struggled with. The combination of total darkness, solitude, fatigue, and hypervigilance could produce hallucinatory experiences indistinguishable from reality. Guards reported conversations with long-dead colleagues, visceral sensations of being watched or followed, and absolutely convinced certainty that something inhuman shared their post during the deepest hours of night. Everyone sees the Grey Lady eventually, says Garrett, with the casual certainty of discussing sunrise. Usually on the eastern perimeter, near the old execution ground, walks the wall, checking the guards. Some say she was a castle defender who died in the Great Siege, still doing her duty centuries later. Others think she's older than the castle itself. He shrugs when asked if he believes these stories. Seen her 3 times myself. Whether she's ghost, trick of moonlight, or just what a tired mind creates after too many night watches, doesn't much matter, does it? She's as real as anything else at 3 hours past midnight. These experiences, whether supernatural or psychological in origin, became woven into night guard culture. Shared stories of strange encounters created a folklore unique to their profession, a way of processing and normalizing the extreme mental states that darkness duty produced. Rather than frightening newcomers, these tales often provided comfort, evidence that their own unsettling experiences weren't signs of weakness or madness, but shared aspects of their difficult profession. Perhaps the most dreaded aspect of night duty was the particular vulnerability to surprise attack. Throughout medieval history, castles were most commonly assaulted under cover of darkness, when defender visibility was compromised, and attackers could approach with some degree of concealment. This reality meant night guards carried a special burden. They were likely to be the first to die if an attack came, with minimal warning and little chance to prepare. Always keep your weapon in hand, never leaning against the wall, instructs Edgar during your training for night rotation. By the time you hear them, they'll already be climbing. By the time you reach for a propped spear, their blade will be in your gut. This constant readiness created its own strain. Day guards might reasonably expect to see approaching forces with enough time to sound alarms, don additional protection, or assume proper defensive positions. Night guards had no such luxury. They existed in a perpetual state of imminent combat, never knowing if each shift might suddenly transform from boring surveillance to desperate life or death struggle. The physical toll of this readiness was substantial. Muscles tensed for hours in anticipation of sudden action, eyes strained to penetrate darkness until headaches pounded behind them, hands gripped weapon hafts until fingers cramped and palms blistered. The body couldn't sustain this alertness indefinitely, yet relaxing vigilance, even momentarily, might mean death, not just for the guard, but for everyone who depended on their warning. Night attacks followed patterns that experienced guards learned to anticipate. The hours just before dawn, when defender alertness was at its lowest ebb, were particularly dangerous. New moon periods that provided maximum darkness were favored by sophisticated attackers. Weather conditions that masked sound, rainfall heavy enough to muffle footsteps, wind strong enough to cover the rattle of equipment, raised threat levels significantly. Weather turns bad. Watch strength doubles, Harrow explains, during a particularly stormy evening deployment. Can't hear them coming. Can barely see 5 paces ahead. Perfect conditions for someone who doesn't want to be noticed until they're already over the wall. For the castle's inhabitants, sleeping safely behind locked doors, these calculations remained abstract. For night guards, they translated to concrete differences in survival probability, subtle shifts in defensive positioning, and the nagging awareness that tonight might be the night when theories about optimal attack conditions would be tested in blood. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of night duty was its thanklessness. Day guards at least performed their function visibly, their presence noted by the castle community, their vigilance acknowledged, even if not actively appreciated. Night guards worked in literal and figurative darkness, unseen, unconsidered, their hardships unwitnessed by those they protected. Best outcome of any night watch is that nothing happens and no one ever knows you were there, says Aldwin during a quiet moment between shifts. Do your job perfectly for 20 years, and your reward is that no one ever has reason to think about what you do. Only time they notice night guards is when something goes catastrophically wrong. This invisibility extended to formal recognition. Castle records rarely mentioned night watch units, except in cases of severe failure or unusual heroism. Payment records, duty rosters, and personnel assignments acknowledged their existence administratively, but their specific hardships and contributions remained largely undocumented. The darkness that defined their working hours seemed to extend metaphorically to their place in castle memory, present but unseen, essential but unacknowledged, bearing unique burdens but receiving no special consideration for them. They were the embodiment of the broader guard experience, taken to its most extreme expression. Yet, despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, night guards often developed a particular pride in their role. They were the elite of an already selective profession, those who could endure conditions that broke lesser men. Their ability to function in darkness, maintain vigilance when others slept, and face the particular terrors of night watch without faltering became a point of identity, a standard against which they measured themselves and others. Day watches for beginners, says Garrett, with the good-natured arrogance of specialists everywhere. Night watches for those who've proven themselves. Anyone can spot an army at noon with the sun at their back. Takes real skill to detect 3 climbers approaching a wall on a moonless midnight. This pride manifested in small traditions specific to night rotation. The ceremonial handover between evening and morning watches included ritual elements absent from day shift changes. Personal equipment often bore distinctive markings or modifications that identified night specialists. Black thread woven through standard uniform elements, particular styles of weight distribution in weapons optimized for fighting in low visibility, specialized hood designs that maximized peripheral vision without compromising warmth. These distinctions created a subculture within the already isolated world of castle guards, a brotherhood defined by shared hardship, specialized knowledge, and the particular intimacy that comes from facing darkness together. Day guards might know the castle in sunlight. Night guards knew its secrets, its vulnerabilities, its hidden life after dark. And now, as you stand your watch through another endless night, you've become part of this tradition. Your eyes ache from straining to separate shadow from threat. Your ears ring with listening for sounds that might never come. Your body fights its natural urge for sleep, while your mind populates the darkness with possibilities, both real and imagined. The moon breaks briefly through cloud cover, illuminating the landscape in a silver light that creates more questions than answers. Was that movement at the forest edge? Is that shadow the same shape it was an hour ago? Did that distant sound come from natural causes or human intent? You'll never know the answers to most of these questions. The majority of night watches end with dawn, revealing an empty landscape. Threats existed only in your vigilant imagination, but someday, perhaps tonight, the shadows might contain genuine danger. The movement might be enemies approaching. The sound might be the beginning of an assault that only you can warn against. And so you stand, hour after hour, night after night, through cold and fear and mind-bending isolation. Not because it's glorious, it's anything but. Not because it's appreciated. Few will ever understand what you endure, but because someone must face the darkness so others can sleep in safety. And that someone is you. The night deepens. Your watch continues. Beyond the physical and psychological challenges of guard duty lay perhaps the most cruel reality of all: the utter lack of future prospects. Unlike many medieval professions that offered advancement, recognition, or at least the dignity of an established retirement, castle guards faced an almost uniformly bleak long-term outlook. Their career trajectory wasn't so much a path as a slow descent into increasing physical limitation, poverty, and eventually, disposability. 3 ways a guard's service ends. Aldwin tells you during a rare moment of complete candor. Die young in action. Die middle-aged from disease or accident. Or live long enough to become useless, then die poor and forgotten somewhere beyond the castle walls. This brutal assessment wasn't exaggeration, but simple observation of patterns repeated across generations of guards. The profession offered virtually no mechanism for meaningful advancement. The command structure was flattened by design. A captain, perhaps a few sergeants or section leaders, and then the mass of ordinary guards. Promotions to these limited leadership positions typically went to men with family connections, noble backing, or exceptional service records, leaving the vast majority of guards at the same rank their entire careers. Been standing the same post for 17 years, says Edgar, with the resignation of someone who stopped expecting change long ago. Same pay, same quarters, same duties. Only difference is, everything hurts more now, and I need twice as long to recover after each watch. Pay itself remained stubbornly stagnant, regardless of experience or competence, while skilled craftsmen might see their wages increase with reputation and master status. Guards received the same modest compensation whether they'd served 1 year or 20. This economic stagnation meant guards couldn't build savings, acquire property, or establish the financial security that other professions might eventually provide. Some older guards showed entrepreneurial initiative, developing side businesses that leveraged their position without technically violating their duties. A few became informal brokers of information, connecting castle inhabitants who needed to communicate discreetly. Others established small-scale trading operations, using their familiarity with merchants to identify opportunities for modest profit. A significant number engaged in low-level gambling operations within the guard barracks, organizing games of chance where they controlled the odds. Werner runs the dice games on third-day evenings. Walter explains, when you ask about the gathering in the corner of the guardroom, takes a percentage from every pot, makes more from that in a night than guard pay provides in a week. Captain knows, but looks the other way, keeps morale up, and provides income for a man too old to find other work. These unofficial economic activities rarely generated substantial wealth, but sometimes provided just enough supplemental income to make guard service sustainable. They also created intricate social networks within the castle community, giving older guards a form of soft power that partially offset their lack of official advancement. Physical deterioration presented the most immediate threat to long-term guard viability. The profession's demands, constant standing, exposure to elements, irregular sleep, poor nutrition, and periodic combat accelerated the aging process considerably. Guards in their 40s often exhibited physical limitations, more commonly associated with men decades older. Knees go first, says Thomas, demonstrating the awkward gait he's developed to manage chronic joint pain. Then back, then shoulders. Eventually, climbing the wall steps becomes its own battle, one you fight every day until you finally lose. The castle administration dealt with aging guards according to no formal policy, but through established patterns that everyone understood without needing explanation. As physical capability declined, guards were typically reassigned to less demanding posts: gate duty instead of wall patrol, day watch instead of night rotation, administrative support rather than active defense. This process continued until the guard reached a threshold of limitation that rendered them ineffective even at reduced duties. What happened next depended largely on the individual castle's traditions and the current lord's temperament. Some fortresses maintained honorary positions for aged guards who had served with particular distinction: doorkeepers, equipment managers, or training assistants who provided institutional knowledge to newer recruits. Old Markham served 60 years before they gave him the armory keys, Aldwin recalls. Couldn't walk the walls anymore, but knew every weapon in the castle's inventory, who it was assigned to, and when it needed maintenance. Kept that position until they found him dead at his desk one morning, still counting crossbow bolts. These accommodations were exceptions rather than rules, however. Most guards faced dismissal once their physical decline rendered them unable to perform essential duties. The manner of this dismissal varied widely. Some received a final payment acknowledging their service. Others simply found their names removed from duty rosters with minimal explanation. Nearly all departed with insufficient resources to support themselves in old age. Lord Harrington's father at least provided a cottage on estate lands for guards who served 20 years or more, says Walter. Current lord discontinued the practice 5 years ago, said it was an unnecessary expense given the availability of younger men seeking positions. The fate of discharged guards depended largely on factors beyond their control. Those with family connections might return to villages or farms, contributing what labor they could still provide while receiving basic support from relatives. Those with particular skills developed alongside their guard duties: literacy, numeracy, craft abilities, sometimes found secondary occupations that could sustain them at subsistence level. Many, however, joined the growing population of destitute former soldiers that populated medieval roadsides and urban peripheries. With bodies too broken for manual labor, minds trained primarily for vigilance and combat, and no systemic support for veterans, they often resorted to begging, petty crime, or selling the only commodity they still possessed: their knowledge of castle defenses and operations to anyone willing to pay. Saw Willem last market day, Roderick mentions quietly during an evening meal. Remember him? Dismissed 3 winters ago when his lungs went bad from night watch. Living in a lean-to outside the East Village now. Selling information about guard rotations to strangers for copper pennies and cups of ale. This intelligence risk created a perverse incentive for castle administration. Once guards became physically incapable, but remained mentally sound, they transformed from assets into potential liabilities. Their intimate knowledge of security procedures, architectural vulnerabilities, and personnel patterns made them dangerous if that information reached hostile forces. Some castles addressed this concern through continued connection with former guards, providing modest pensions or accommodations that maintained loyalty. Others took darker approaches. Forgrave kept asking questions about Auric after he was dismissed, says Garrett in a near whisper during night watch. Captain told him to stop. He didn't. Week later, they found him floating in the mill pond. Official word was drunken accident. Draw your own conclusions. While such extreme measures were exceptional, they reflected the fundamental problem that medieval society had no established framework for supporting those who could no longer support themselves through labor. In the absence of retirement systems, social welfare, or veterans' benefits, aged guards relied entirely on individual charity or personal resources, both typically inadequate to the need. For guards still actively serving, watching the fate of their older colleagues provided daily reminder of their own likely future. This awareness created a particular psychology, a mixture of fatalism, present-focused thinking, and emotional detachment that characterized the profession. Why save for tomorrow when tomorrow so clearly held nothing but decline? Why form deep attachments when all paths led to eventual abandonment? Why strive for excellence when experience brought no corresponding reward? Live today, die tomorrow, forgotten the day after, goes a common guard saying. The sentiment behind it wasn't mere cynicism, but pragmatic adaptation to observable reality. The profession offered no path to security, recognition, or legacy. At best, it provided temporary stability at the cost of long-term prospects. This bleak outlook didn't prevent guards from forming meaningful connections, finding moments of joy, or taking pride in their work. The human capacity for creating purpose persists even in difficult circumstances, but it colored everything they did with the knowledge that their service, however dedicated, led inevitably to discard. We're like torches, Aldwin reflects, during what will prove to be one of your final conversations before his own dismissal for failing eyesight. Necessary, useful, while we burn, but expected to consume ourselves in service. Once the flame dies down, we're just charred sticks to be tossed aside while a new torch takes our place. He smiles without humor, the firelight accentuating the deep lines carved into his face by decades of exposure and strain. Remember that when the captain praises your vigilance, or the Lord acknowledges your presence with a nod, you're not a person to them. You're a functional object with an expiration date. This harsh perspective wasn't universal. Individual lords, captains, and castles sometimes demonstrated genuine care for aged guards through various accommodations, but these exceptions only highlighted the absence of systemic support, the fundamental disposability built into the profession's structure. For you, still relatively early in your service, these realities hover at the edge of consciousness rather than dominating your thoughts. The immediate challenges of surviving each watch, navigating castle politics, and maintaining basic physical well-being consume most of your attention. But on quiet nights, when the walls are peaceful and your mind wanders, the future casts its shadow forward. You've seen what happens to guards who survive long enough to age out of usefulness. You've heard the stories of those dismissed after years of loyalty, their final days spent in poverty and obscurity. You've watched as comrades who once stood beside you on these same walls transformed gradually from respected defenders to unwelcome reminders of mortality, then disappeared from castle life entirely. And yet tomorrow, you'll take your position again, You'll stand your watch, scan the horizon for threats, endure cold and fatigue and danger for another day. Not because you don't understand the bargain, but because understanding it doesn't change the fundamental reality. This is what you have, what you know, what you can do. The profession that will eventually discard you is also, for now, the only thing standing between you and immediate destitution. The moon slides behind clouds, casting the battlements in the deeper shadow. Somewhere in the darkness, a fox cries out, the sound eerily similar to a human in pain. You adjust your position, shifting weight from one aching leg to the other, and continue your endless vigilance. One more hour until relief comes. One more day crossed off a limited supply. One more watch in a life defined by watching. This is what it meant to be a medieval castle guard. Not just the immediate hardships of the position, but the knowledge that those hardships led nowhere, except to more hardships, until body or mind failed, and the castle had no further use for either. The true misery wasn't in the cold, or the danger, or the boredom, though these were considerable. It was in the absolute certainty that your sacrifice earned nothing beyond temporary survival, that your dedication went unrecorded, that your eventual fate was already written in the bent backs and rheumy eyes of the old guards counting their final watches before dismissal. And yet, there remains a kind of dignity in this awareness, a clear-eyed acceptance of reality without illusion or false hope. You stand your watch not because you expect reward or recognition, but because someone must. You endure not because conditions will improve, but because endurance itself has value. You maintain vigilance not because it leads to advancement, but because lives depend on your attention. In this stark clarity, this acceptance of limitation, without surrender to despair, castle guards perhaps achieved a form of wisdom unavailable to those with more comfortable lives and more promising futures. They saw the world without pretense, understood their place within it without delusion, and still chose to fulfill their duty despite knowing exactly what it cost and exactly how it ended. Dawn approaches, painting the eastern sky with reluctant light. Another night survived, another watch completed without incident, another day begun in a life with limited days remaining. You straighten your back, ignoring familiar pain, and prepare to hand over your post to the morning relief. This was the reality of medieval castle guards. Not just the physical hardships and daily dangers, but the absolute certainty that their service, however necessary, would ultimately end in disposal. And yet they stood their watch, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, because someone had to stand between safety and chaos. Someone had to watch while others slept. Someone had to place themselves between danger and those they protected. That someone was you, and countless others like you, standing endless vigil on stone walls throughout medieval Europe, your names unrecorded, your sacrifices unnoted, your eventual fates grimly predictable. Not glorious warriors celebrated in song, but necessary guardians, consumed by duty and eventually discarded. The true, unromantic face of medieval security. The morning bell sounds. Your relief arrives. Bleary-eyed but dutiful, you hand over your post with the traditional warning to stay alert, then descend worn stone steps toward a few hours of insufficient rest before your next assignment. The cycle continues, as it has for generations before you and will for generations after. The morning sun rises over the castle walls, but you don't see it. You're huddled in the small, windowless room that passes for the guard's infirmary, watching as the castle's physician, a man whose medical training consists mainly of having survived longer than most of his patients, examines the festering wound, Your forearm, 3 days ago, it was just a small cut from a rusty hinge on the portcullis mechanism. Now, it's a red, swollen mess that radiates heat and pain up to your shoulder. Bad, the physician grunts, prodding the wound with fingers that smell of garlic and something unidentifiable. Might keep the arm, might not, depends if the rot spreads. This casual assessment of potential amputation is delivered without emotion, as if discussing the weather. In the medieval world, infection wasn't just a medical condition, it was a potential death sentence, especially for castle guards who couldn't afford to rest or receive proper care. Tonight, we'll explore the brutal reality of disease, injury, and medical care for medieval castle guards, a world where a small scratch could lead to the grave, where chronic pain was simply an expected part of existence, and where the treatments were often as dangerous as the conditions they attempted to address. Disease was the silent killer that claimed far more guards than enemy weapons ever did. The cramped, unsanitary living conditions of medieval castles created perfect breeding grounds for illness. Guards typically slept in communal barracks, dark, poorly ventilated spaces where a dozen or more men might share air, bedding, parasites, and whatever infections they carried. Jenkins brought back the flux from the village last month, says Edgar, nodding toward an empty bunk in the corner. Within 10 days, 7 men had it. 2 died. The rest of us spent our watches running to the latrine between patrols. Captain wouldn't reduce duties or rotation, said walls had to be manned regardless of who could stand and who couldn't. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was perhaps the most common serious illness in castle environments, spread through contaminated food and water. It caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and eventual death if untreated. For guards already weakened by poor nutrition and exhaustion, it could be particularly devastating. Respiratory diseases posed another constant threat. Guards spent hours exposed to all weather conditions, their bodies alternating between the freezing temperatures of night watches and the overheated, smoky interiors where they took meals and brief rest. This cycle weakened lung resistance and created chronic conditions that medieval medicine had no way to effectively treat. Winter cough, they called the persistent hacking, that afflicted almost every guard who survived more than a few seasons. Some developed it seasonally, their breathing becoming increasingly labored as cold weather set in. Others carried it year-round, their lungs permanently damaged by years of inhaling damp night air, smoke from torches and hearths, and the dust of stone passageways. You can tell how long a man's been a guard by the sound of his cough, Aldwin explains, demonstrating his own deep, wet hack that seems to come from somewhere beneath his ribs. New recruits have that sharp, sudden cough. 5-year men have the morning throat clear that lasts an hour. 10-year veterans sound like they're trying to bring up a lung. 20-year men, like me, we don't even notice we're doing it anymore. This casual acceptance of progressive respiratory damage reflected the broader guard approach to illness. It wasn't a question of whether your health would deteriorate, but merely how quickly and in what particular ways. The profession guaranteed physical decline. The only variable was its specific path. Skin conditions flourished in the guard barracks. Fungal infections spread rapidly through shared quarters and equipment. Thriving in the perpetually damp conditions of stone castles, ringworm, athlete's foot, and various forms of dermatitis created constant discomfort, while more serious infections like erysipelas could lead to fever, systemic illness, and occasionally death. Got this from trying on Dirk's helmet when mine was being repaired, says Perrin, showing a patchy bald spot on his scalp where fungal infection has destroyed the hair follicles. Spreads around the barracks like wildfire. Most of us have had it somewhere on our bodies. Parasites were so common, they were hardly considered medical conditions at all. Lice infested hair, beards, and clothing seams. Fleas maintained permanent residence in straw bedding. Intestinal worms affected almost everyone periodically, causing malnutrition even when food was adequate, as the parasites consumed nutrients before the body could absorb them. Guards developed rudimentary approaches to managing these unwelcome companions. Regular delousing sessions became social events in the barracks, men helping each other check hair and clothing seams. Herbal treatments, like wormwood and garlic, were consumed regularly in attempt to purge intestinal parasites. Bedding was occasionally dragged into sunlight when weather permitted, in hope that heat might kill some of the infestation. Thursday is burning day, Walter explains when you ask about the smoke rising from behind the barracks. We strip the beds, take whatever can be spared to the yard, and pass everything quickly through fire. Doesn't eliminate the vermin entirely, but keeps them from completely overrunning us for another week. These management techniques reflected the reality that complete elimination of parasites was impossible in medieval conditions. The goal was merely to keep infestation at levels that permitted continued function. Another example of the compromised standards that defined guard existence. Beyond these common afflictions, guards faced elevated risk of specific diseases related to their duties and environment. Those assigned to Watergate duty or moat maintenance frequently contracted waterborne illnesses. Guards, who interacted regularly with incoming travelers and merchants, had greater exposure to whatever infections visitors carried. Those posted near castle livestock areas often developed zoonotic diseases transmitted from animals to humans. The most feared outbreaks, however, were those that swept through entire regions: plague, sweating sickness, or smallpox. When these epidemics reached a castle, guards suffered disproportionately, while nobility might retreat to isolated chambers or flee to country estates. Security personnel had to maintain their posts regardless of risk, ensuring castle function even as disease decimated their ranks. Lost half the guard company in the summer plague of '86, recalls Harrow, the night captain. Still had to maintain full watch rotation with half the men. Survivors stood double shifts for weeks. Working alongside corpses, we had no time to remove from the walls. Some men took turns standing dead companions upright at visible posts, just to make approaching travelers think the castle had more defenders than it did. His matter-of-fact description of propping dead guards on the battlements highlights the brutal pragmatism that governed castle security. The walls had to appear manned, the defensive perimeter maintained, regardless of how many actually remained alive to defend it. Individual guards were expendable. The appearance of strength was not. This expendability extended to medical care as well. When castle resources became strained, whether through siege, famine, or disease outbreak, guards typically received lowest priority for treatment. Noble family members, specialized craftspeople, and skilled military personnel, like knights, would receive whatever medical attention and supplies were available. Common guards waited until these higher status patients had been treated, often receiving no care at all when resources ran out. Lord's hunting dog cut its paw last spring, Edgar notes with bitter amusement. Castle physician spent an hour cleaning and bandaging it, used expensive honey from the special stores to prevent infection. That same week, Garrett broke his arm falling from the south wall during a storm, got it pulled straight and bound with dirty linen, then sent back to duty the next day. Dog got better treatment than any guard I've ever seen. This inequality of care reflected the fundamental reality of medieval castle medicine. It was distributed according to perceived value rather than need. A skilled blacksmith might receive significant medical attention because his function was difficult to replace. A common guard, considered interchangeable with any able-bodied man willing to stand watch, received minimal investment in recovery. The actual medical treatments available within a typical castle ranged from occasionally effective to actively harmful. Castle physicians occupied an ambiguous position between empirical practitioners and theoretical experts, their approaches combining practical observation with medical theories inherited from ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates. At the foundation of medieval medical understanding was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance supposedly determined health. Illness was attributed to imbalance among these substances, leading to treatments focused on restoring equilibrium rather than addressing specific pathogens or conditions. Physician said I had too much blood and not enough yellow bile, explains Roderick, showing a row of small scars on his forearm where he's been bled repeatedly. Every third day, he opens a vein and lets out a cup or so. Been doing it for months now. Can't say I feel any better, but he claims it's necessary. Bloodletting was among the most common treatments for almost any condition involving inflammation, fever, or visible swelling, all frequent consequences of the injuries and infections guards regularly sustained. The practice weakened already compromised patients, sometimes fatally, particularly when performed too aggressively or too frequently on men whose nutrition and rest were inadequate to replace lost blood. Purgatives represented another standard approach to illness. Powerful herbal preparations or mineral compounds induced vomiting or diarrhea, supposedly expelling harmful substances from the body. In reality, these treatments often caused dangerous dehydration in patients already weakened by disease, accelerating decline rather than promoting recoveries. Garth took the physician's purging potion for his fever, Walter recalls, shaking his head at the memory. Spent 2 days voiding from both ends until there was nothing left in him but spite. Fever broke, but he was so weak afterward he couldn't stand his watch for a week. Captain docked his pay for the missed shifts. This financial penalty for illness-related absence created perverse incentives for guards to avoid official medical treatment whenever possible. Many developed their own approaches to managing injuries and disease, creating an underground medical tradition passed from veteran to novice through direct instruction and shared experience. Never go to the physician unless you're certain you're dying, advises Aldwin during your first month of service. Even then, consider your options carefully. Guards have our own ways. He proceeds to show you a collection of herbs, poultices, and tinctures he's accumulated through decades of trial and error, some purchased from village healers, others gathered from castle grounds, all carefully hidden from official medical authorities who might confiscate such unauthorized treatments. These guard remedies reflected practical experience rather than formal medical theory. Certain plants demonstrably reduced pain or inflammation when applied topically. Specific preparations helped manage fever or quiet coughs temporarily. Techniques for wound cleaning and bandaging evolved through observation of which approaches led to better outcomes. Moldy bread on infected cuts, demonstrates Edgar, carefully placing a greenish crust over a fellow guard's wound. Looks disgusting, smells worse, but works better than anything the physician offers. Old stablemaster taught me this years ago. His father was a battle surgeon for 3 kings. This folk application of what would later be understood as penicillin exemplifies how practical observation sometimes produced effective treatments despite the absence of theoretical understanding. Guards shared these remedies as valuable professional secrets, their efficacy validated not by authority, but by observable results. The most dangerous aspect of medieval medical practice wasn't just its ineffectiveness, but its active potential for harm. Toxic substances featured prominently in official treatments. Mercury, arsenic, and lead appeared in compounds prescribed for various conditions. Their poisonous effects often mistaken for symptoms of the original illness. Court physician gave Lord Haverden's youngest son mercury pills for his cough last winter, recalls Thomas, who serves as personal guard to noble family members. Boy turned gray, lost his hair, and his gums bled for months afterward. Survived the treatment, but hasn't been the same since. Still, physician claimed victory because the cough eventually stopped. Surgical interventions represented another significant danger. Without understanding of germ theory, sterile technique, or effective anesthesia, medieval surgeons performed operations that frequently introduced infection, caused traumatic blood loss, or inflicted unbearable pain. For guards, amputation was the most commonly encountered surgical procedure, typically performed when infection in a limb threatened to spread systemically. Saw them take Baldwin's leg after it went bad from that mace wound, says Walter, his normally steady voice wavering slightly at the memory. 4 men held him down while the barber surgeon used a carpenter's saw on the thigh. No proper physician would dirty his hands with such work. Baldwin screamed until his voice gave out, then made these animal sounds I still hear in bad dreams. Died anyway, 3 days later, from the wound fever. The trauma of witnessing such procedures affected guard psychology profoundly. Many developed intense fear of official medical intervention, preferring to manage injuries independently, even when doing so reduced survival chances. Others became fatalistic, assuming that serious injury inevitably meant death regardless of treatment. Some adopted a peculiar gallows humor around medicine, joking about procedures and outcomes as a way of managing terror they couldn't otherwise express. We say the physician has 2 cures, Harrow explains, during a rare moment of dark candor. If you can walk in to see him, he bleeds you until you can't. If you're carried in, he cuts until you're lighter to carry out. Either way, you leave worse than you arrived. This cynicism wasn't universal. Some castle physicians genuinely attempted to help patients using the limited knowledge available to them. Certain treatments, particularly those involving wound cleaning, basic fracture setting, or herbal pain management, occasionally produced positive outcomes. But the overall medical landscape facing injured or ill guards remained bleak, with interventions as likely to harm as to heal. Chronic conditions presented particular challenges in the medieval medical context. While acute emergencies might receive at least some attention, long-term health problems typically went untreated beyond basic symptom management. Guards suffering from cumulative damage to joints, spines, or internal organs received little beyond occasional pain remedies or duty modifications. If symptoms became severely limiting, my left knee hasn't bent properly in 8 years, says Edgar, demonstrating the stiffness that forces him to navigate castle stairs with a distinctive sideways gait. Physician looked at it once, said the joint fluid had thickened with age and cold, and there was nothing to be done except wrap it warmly in winter. Gave me a potion of willow bark for the pain that I could have made myself for half the cost. This approach to chronic conditions reflected medieval medicine's limited understanding of degenerative processes and lack of effective interventions for most internal disorders. It also reflected the economic reality that investing medical resources in aging guards with non-life-threatening conditions made little sense from the castle's perspective, particularly when those guards would eventually become too disabled to serve. Regardless of treatment, mental health conditions, though not conceptualized in modern terms, presented another medical challenge that went largely unaddressed. Guards experiencing what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, or post-traumatic stress received responses ranging from dismissive to actively hostile, with symptoms often attributed to moral failing, insufficient discipline, or supernatural influence. Edmund started having the shaking fits after the siege last summer, Roderick explains quietly, glancing toward a guard who sits alone at meals, his hands trembling visibly around his cup. Saw his brother take an arrow through the eye right beside him on the wall. Now, he can't stand the night watch. Says he keeps seeing things coming over the battlements. Captain says he's just weak-minded. Physician gave him some foul-smelling tincture that just makes him sleep so heavily he can barely function during day shifts. The limited responses to psychological trauma reflected not just medical ignorance, but cultural attitudes that prioritized stoicism and viewed emotional disturbance as character deficit rather than legitimate health concern. Guards suffering from combat trauma, chronic stress, or the psychological effects of constant vigilance typically received minimal sympathy and no effective treatment, creating additional suffering beyond their physical hardships. For guards who survived long enough to develop age-related conditions, cataracts, hearing loss, arthritis, or cognitive decline, the medical response was similarly minimal. These changes were viewed as natural deterioration rather than treatable disorders, with intervention limited to duty reassignment when impairment reached levels that compromised basic function. Old Markham couldn't see past his spear length by the time they finally removed him from wall duty, recalls Aldwin. Physician said his eyes had clouded with age. Nothing to be done. Spent his last 3 years as a gate guard, squinting at visitors and pretending he could still distinguish faces. Everyone knew, but no one said anything. Man had 40 years on the walls. Deserved to keep his dignity, at least. This accommodating approach to age-related disability was the exception, rather than rule, however. Most guards found that serious medical conditions of any type eventually led to dismissal once they significantly impaired performance. The castle's investment in treatment remained constrained by the fundamental calculation of guard replaceability. Why expend resources healing someone who could be replaced by a new recruit at lower cost? Preventive medicine, a concept barely recognized in the medieval period, was particularly absent from guard healthcare, while certain basic practices, like wound cleaning or protection against extreme cold, might be encouraged for pragmatic reasons. The broader understanding that health could be maintained through systematic preventive measures simply didn't exist. Guards instead operated on a reactive model, addressing problems only after they became symptomatic, and often only after they began to interfere with duty performance. This approach guaranteed that minor treatable conditions regularly progressed to serious or fatal ones, as early intervention remained rare and effective screening non-existent. Hacking up blood for 2 months before I mentioned it to anyone, admits Walter during a quiet evening conversation. Figured it would either stop or kill me, and either way, complaining wouldn't help. Only reported it when I couldn't complete wall patrol without stopping to catch my breath. Physician said my lungs were corrupted from years of night watch in the damp, gave me some syrup that tastes like sweetened piss, and told me to sleep sitting upright. That's the extent of treatment available for something like this. His matter-of-fact acceptance of this minimal response to potentially fatal symptoms exemplifies the guard approach to personal health, a combination of stoicism, fatalism, and pragmatic recognition of limited options. When effective treatments didn't exist and reporting illness might threaten your position, silence and endurance often seemed the most rational choices. The social dimensions of illness and injury added another layer of complexity to guard medical experiences. Certain conditions carried moral judgments or stigma beyond their physical effects. Venereal diseases, contracted during guard visits to prostitutes in castle towns or nearby villages, prompted particular disdain from medical authorities and often resulted in punitive responses rather than treatment. Jenkins caught the French pox from that brothel near the West Gate, says Garrett. Physician made him stand before the entire guard company while he described the symptoms and progression in excruciating detail, calling it divine punishment for moral corruption. Then gave him mercury ointment that burned his skin off along with the sores, treatment worse than disease. But the public shaming was worst of all. Other conditions like epilepsy or certain skin diseases might be attributed to supernatural causes, divine punishment, demonic influence, or magical curses. Guards suffering from these disorders faced not just physical symptoms, but social isolation, suspicion, and occasionally dangerous cures intended to address spiritual rather than medical causes. Had a seizure during morning muster last year, Perrin confides when you ask about the small cross-shaped scar visible on his forehead. Captain thought I was possessed. Had the chaplain perform an exorcism that involved pressing a heated cross to my skin to let the devil out. Now I hide the small fits when they come, bite my tongue till it bleeds rather than let anyone see. Better than being branded again, or worse. These social dimensions of illness created additional burdens beyond physical suffering. Guards learned to conceal symptoms when possible, particularly those carrying moral stigma or supernatural associations. They developed codes for discussing certain conditions, euphemisms that allowed them to seek advice from comrades without risking broader exposure. River fever might refer to venereal disease, allowing guards to ask about symptoms or treatments without admitting to activities that could bring punishment. Winter melancholy could indicate depression or anxiety, framing psychological distress in seasonal terms that carried less stigma than admitting to fear or emotional disturbance. Old campaigners' shakes described tremors associated with alcoholism, combat trauma, or neurological damage, providing cover for conditions that might otherwise be attributed to moral weakness. This coded language reflected the guards' need to maintain both function and reputation within an environment that viewed illness as potential character deficit rather than medical condition. It also facilitated the underground medical knowledge, sharing that often provided more practical help than official treatments. For you, now sitting in the castle infirmary, while the physician examines your infected arm, these realities converge into immediate concern. The cut itself was minor, a moment's carelessness while adjusting the portcullis chain, but the rapidly spreading infection represents genuine threat to both limb and life. The physician's casual assessment of potential amputation isn't melodrama, but practical acknowledgement of how quickly such infections can turn fatal. We'll try the hot iron first, he decides, gesturing to his assistant to heat a metal rod in the small brazier, burning in the corner. Burn out the corruption before it spreads further. If that fails, the saw tomorrow. You've seen this procedure performed on fellow guards. The searing pain, the smell of burning flesh, the screams that no amount of willpower can completely suppress. You've also seen the outcomes. Sometimes successful containment of infection, sometimes acceleration of systemic decline, as the traumatic procedure further weakens already compromised patients. Hold him, the physician instructs two early assistants who move to grip your shoulders and legs No pain medication is offered beyond a stick to bite down on, partly due to limited supplies, partly reflecting the belief that pain itself serves therapeutic purpose by awakening the body's natural healing power. As the assistant approaches with the glowing iron rod, you understand with perfect clarity the true meaning of being a medieval castle guard, not just the cold watches, dangerous duty, or social isolation, though these are considerable hardships, but this fundamental reality: your body, like your life, belongs not to you, but to the castle. It will be used until damaged, repaired if practical, discarded if not, with minimal consideration for your comfort or survival beyond your continued utility as defensive equipment. The iron touches your infected flesh, and pain overwhelms conscious thought. Through the haze of agony, you dimly register the physician's clinical interest as he watches your response. The assistant's practiced efficiency in restraining your involuntary movements and the complete absence of comforting words or gestures. This isn't healing, as modern medicine would understand it. It's mechanical repair of castle property, performed with the same detached assessment a blacksmith might bring to mending a damaged hinge or bent sword. Hours later, arm bandaged and throbbing beneath layers of boiled vinegar-soaked linen, you rejoin your fellow guards in the barracks. No recovery time is granted beyond the remainder of today's watch. You're expected at your post by morning bell, regardless of pain or weakness from blood loss. The physician's parting instructions were minimal. Keep the burn clean if possible. Report back if fever develops. Prepare for amputation if the arm darkens or swells further. Better than most get, observes Edgar when you describe the treatment. At least he tried the iron before taking the arm. Must think you're worth keeping somewhat intact. His matter-of-fact assessment contains neither cruelty nor particular sympathy, just the pragmatic evaluation of men who understand precisely how little their physical suffering matters to the institution they serve. Around you, the barracks contains a catalog of similar stories. Guards in various stages of injury and recovery, each managing pain and limitation, while continuing to perform required duties. Roderick favors his right leg, where an old arrow wound never properly healed. Walter's breathing carries the distinctive wheeze of chronic lung damage. Thomas can no longer fully raise his left arm after a shoulder dislocation improperly set 3 years ago. Each adapts, compensates, and continues functioning because the alternative is dismissal and destitution. Learn to work around it, advises Aldwin, noting your awkward attempts to adjust equipment with your injured arm. Pain becomes just another condition of existence, like cold or hunger or exhaustion. Body adapts if mind permits it. Those who can't adapt don't last as guards. This capacity for adaptation represents perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval guard medical reality. Without effective treatments, pain management, or recovery accommodations, guards nonetheless maintained function through injuries and illnesses that would completely disable most modern individuals. They developed extraordinary pain tolerance, compensatory movement patterns, and psychological compartmentalization that allowed continued performance despite significant impairment. Can't grip properly with these last 2 fingers since they were broken on the drawbridge crank, demonstrates Garrett, showing how he's modified his spear-holding technique to accommodate permanent nerve damage. Adapted my fighting stance, shifted weight distribution, learned new patterns. Not as good as before, perhaps, but good enough to keep my position. That's all that matters. This adaptive capacity wasn't just physical, but psychological. Guards developed mental frameworks that accommodated their medical realities without surrendering to despair. They created hierarchies of concern, distinguishing between merely painful conditions and genuinely dangerous ones. They established informal support systems, with veterans guiding newer guards through recovery from common injuries. They built identities that incorporated rather than rejected physical limitation, finding pride in function maintained despite impairment. "Show me a guard without scars," goes an old saying among the castle's defenders, "and I'll show you a guard who started this morning." The sentiment captures both the inevitability of injury in the profession and the quiet pride taken in survival despite it, each scar representing a wound that failed to kill, a condition endured, a story of persistence in the face of bodily betrayal. As night falls and pain from your burned arm makes sleep impossible, you join the small group of similarly wakeful guards gathered around the barracks' central hearth. Their conversations drift between practical advice for managing specific conditions, dark humor about the physician's limited repertoire of treatments, and occasional, serious discussion of which injuries merit seeking help versus attempting self-treatment. Fever with red streaks moving up a limb, go to the physician immediately, counsels Walter, his voice carrying the authority of experience. Might lose the limb, but waiting means losing your life. Same with gut wounds, deep chest punctures, or head injuries that leave you confused for more than an hour. Everything else, we handle ourselves, unless it prevents standing watch for more than 3 days. This triage approach reflects guards' accumulated wisdom about which conditions medieval medicine might actually help versus those where official intervention likely caused more harm than the original injury. It represents a sophisticated risk assessment developed not through formal education, but painful collective experience across generations of guards who suffered, recovered, or died under the castle's minimal medical care. "Remember Willem?" asks Edgar, stoking the fire as he speaks. "Cut himself breaking up that tavern fight last summer. Small wound, barely bled, but he went to the physician because it was on his face, and he worried about scarring. Got it stitched with silk thread that had been used on 3 previous patients. Wound festered within days, infection spread to his eye, then his brain, dead within a week from a cut that would have healed clean if he'd just washed it with ale and left it open to the air." Such cautionary tales circulate constantly among guards, creating an oral medical tradition that often contradicted official practice. This underground knowledge sometimes included genuine insights, like recognizing the importance of wound cleaning or understanding which herbal preparations effectively reduced inflammation, mixed with superstition, coincidental associations, and outdated theories passed down without critical evaluation. The result was a parallel medical system operating alongside official castle healthcare, guards treating themselves and each other based on collective experience rather than formal training. Some of these treatments worked better than physician-prescribed alternatives. Others were equally ineffective or occasionally harmful, but all reflected the fundamental reality that guards could not rely on castle medicine to prioritize their well-being or effectively address their needs. Your arm throbs with each heartbeat, the burned tissue radiating waves of pain that make focusing on conversation increasingly difficult. Noticing your discomfort, Aldwin disappears briefly to his personal chest, returning with a small cloth bundle that he unwraps to reveal dried herbs and a tiny pottery jar. "Poppy extract mixed with wine," he explains, measuring a carefully controlled amount onto a spoon. "Dangerous if you take too much, but this dose will dull the pain enough for sleep without stopping your breathing. Guard remedy, not physician approved. Use it tonight, but not for more than 3 nights running, or it grips the mind and doesn't let go." This informal dispensing of what modern medicine would recognize as opiate medication exemplifies the guard approach to pain management: practical, experience-based, and operating outside official medical channels. The careful dosage instruction reflects hard-won knowledge about both the remedy's benefits and its significant risks, passed from veteran to newer guard without institutional documentation or approval. You accept the medicine, swallowing the bitter mixture, and feeling gradually spreading numbness replace the sharp pulsing in your arm. Around you, similar exchanges happen regularly, guards sharing remedies, techniques, and adaptive strategies that make continued function possible despite injury, illness, and inadequate medical care. This is the reality of medieval castle guard medicine, not the official treatments prescribed by physicians or recorded in castle accounts, but the underground system of practical knowledge, mutual support, and adaptive technique that actually enabled guards to survive and function. It represents perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their profession, not just enduring hardship, but creating effective responses to it through collective experience when official systems failed to address their needs. As the poppy extract dulls your pain and draws you towards sleep, you reflect on what you've learned about guard medical reality through your own injury. The official castle physician, with his bloodletting and hot irons, represents just one dimension of medieval healthcare. Equally important is this informal system surrounding you, the accumulated wisdom of men who have suffered similar wounds, the practical remedies developed through trial and error, the adaptive techniques that allow continued function despite limitation. Tomorrow, you'll return to your post regardless of pain or healing status, because that's what guards do. They continue until they physically cannot, then adapt until adaptation becomes impossible, then disappear quietly when the castle no longer considers them useful. In this harsh reality lies both the profession's greatest misery and its peculiar dignity, the absolute commitment to function despite suffering, to duty despite physical limitation, to the collective security of the castle despite individual well-being. The last thing you see before drifting into narcotic sleep is Aldwin carefully rewrapping his bundle of unofficial remedies and returning it to its hiding place beneath loose floorboards, a small arsenal against pain preserved and expanded through generations of guards who understood that their survival depended not on castle medicine, but on each other. In this, as in so many aspects of guard life, the true system that sustains the profession remains invisible to those who benefit from its protection, a hidden network of knowledge, support, and adaptation that enables continued function in conditions designed to consume and discard those who maintain them. Your injured arm will either heal or not. You'll either keep your position or join the ranks of discarded guards whose bodies broke beyond useful function. What matters isn't the outcome, but the process, the continued vigilance, adapted duty, and quiet endurance that defines not just your response to injury, but your entire existence as a medieval castle guard. The fire burns low. Pain fades beneath the poppy's influence. Tomorrow brings another watch, another day of vigilance, performed through discomfort that would incapacitate those with more options and less necessity. This is what it means to be a guard, not just standing against external threats, but against the body's own limitations, against inadequate care, against a system that values your function but not your suffering. This is what it meant to be a medieval castle guard. This is why it sucked.